Well, that's a good memory. At least it wasn't a bad memory.
Yeah, that was my first memory of you.
I'm just chuckling because my best friend met my husband with her boobs hanging out. And we're all good about this.
It was fine.
Yeah, there's boobs, no big deal. Unpacking Mormonism is a subsidiary of Daisy Girl Communications, LLC. All content herein is intended for educational purposes only and does not replace the advice or counsel of your personal care provider. Hello, and welcome back to Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma. I'm your host, Sarah Westbrook, joined today by my co-host and hot, sexy husband, Mason Westbrook, who has been retired from the military for 8 months now? Yeah, he's nodding. 8 months now. About 8 months now, and has finally embraced the growing of a beard, and we're loving it. So he's hairy now too. We are also joined by one of my closest friends. We've been besties for about 19 years, right, Danny?
Yeah, about 19.
About 19 years. So Danny and I met when you were in the hospital recovering from surgery and in Relief Society. So we had moved to El Paso, Texas. Mason had finished basic and AIT and nursing school. So Mason was an LVN in the Army, or the equivalent of an LPN in the civilian world. And we moved to El Paso. We were in Relief Society, and there was a sign-up list going around for things that the ward could do, the Mormon church could do to help your family, because Tim was deployed in Iraq, and you had 3 boys, right? Because you had Ben.
Yeah, I had my brother who was 19.
Was he 19?
He was 19. He had just graduated. No, he was 18. He had just graduated from high school, and
I remember him being like 15.
No, he was graduated because that was the semester that he went to college, and it was the first time he was away from mom, so he was free and specializing in girls in college. And I said to him, "Bro, this is not cool. This is not why you're." Well, he's like, he was 18. He didn't know what he wanted to do. He didn't want to go on a mission because his dad strongly discouraged it.
Okay.
So my husband deployed, and I was in a new place with 2 kids, and I couldn't do it. He'd been gone for basic and AIT. We'd lived together maybe 2 months after that, and he got deployment orders, and I just lost it. And so my brother was in college, and he said, "I'll come live with you and go to college."
Awesome. So you had brother.
I had my brother, and then my oldest, and my middle one. And my middle one.
How old was Amber at that time?
So they would have been, they're 9 years older than Kenneth. So maybe 10.
Okay, so Amber was 10.
Amber was 10.
Kenneth was like 18 months?
No, he turned a year when we were in guest quarters at Fort Bliss.
No, yeah, you're right. So I remember
he would have been
because
like 14 months.
Right, because my oldest, Eric, is almost exactly a year older
like
than Kenneth.
10 days difference in birthday.
So yes, Kenneth would have been about a year because Eric would have been about 2.
Yeah.
A little over 2 when we got there. So you had only been there a short period of time. Your husband deploys, and of course, in true military wife, spouse fashion, you have to have major surgery. And you were in the hospital for a long time.
I had a little minor surgery. My mom came, and I came home from the hospital. I was fine. And by the time she left, I wasn't feeling good. And they took me up, and I was like seeing the surgeon. And I was so weak. I couldn't think. I couldn't focus. I was septic.
Right.
And so my surgeon was like, "We're going to put you in the hospital." And I was like, "No, my husband is going to be online in 30 minutes. I'm going home." And he was
Okay,
like, you
so-
have to come back.
So gotta pause. In the military, when a spouse is deployed and something's going on, like it's normal for spouses to be like, because there weren't cell phones, Messenger was still a new thing. Was that the deployment you and Tim had bought, like satellite phones?
His dad bought a satellite phone for us.
Which was unheard of. Like cell phones were still not something that everybody had yet at that time. Like cell phones were reserved for people who were more financially stable. Like this was not the time of cell phones and ease of communication while overseas. Like there was no such thing as WhatsApp, y'all.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing.
No.
And so if we knew the spouse was calling, we were at that phone because we would get a 10-minute conversation, maybe, if we were lucky, before they were gone again.
Yeah. And he had an internet cafe that he could go to, but he could only be there like 30 minutes. And I was like, I'm going home. And they're like,
Right.
my surgeon was like, I will come to your house and get you if you don't come back. And I came.
Also, military families, I know where you live. I outrank your husband. I will make sure the FRG comes to find you.
I came back to the hospital at like 6 p.m. and he said he was not a resident, whatever's above a resident before you're a full dog.
Is that a fellow Mason?
No, there's just different years of residency. So he was probably like a chief resident.
Yeah. Okay. Like a chief resident. And he said, I'm going to wait until my senior surgeon comes back. He was in San Antonio. He flew back and he got off the plane at midnight. I was in the OR at 2 a.m.
Wow.
Like they didn't even take my jewelry off me. I remember coming out of the OR. Mason was my nurse.
Yes, that was the other thing. Mason was your nurse.
He was. And I kept tapping my wedding band because I wanted my husband and I couldn't talk. Mm-hmm. And I was a nursing mother. And Mason, my first memory of you, honestly, is you covering my boobs back up. Because I could feel my engorged boobs hanging out of my hospital gown. And nobody like gave a shit. And Mason came over and just very nicely covered me back up and tied it at my neck. It was like the sweetest, kindest, humanizing thing ever. And that's my first memory of you, Mason.
Well, that's a good memory. At least it wasn't a bad memory.
Yeah, that was my first memory of you.
I'm just chuckling because my best friend met my husband with her boobs hanging out. And we're all good about this.
It was fine.
Yeah, there's boobs, no big deal.
And then I was in the hospital like 7 days. And my mom had to go back to work. My father-in-law came up because we had a stick shift. My brother couldn't drive a stick shift. So he only had his little,
Was that your Forester?
yes,
I loved that car.
I did too.
It's a good car.
But Ben couldn't drive it because it was stick shift.
Right?
And he couldn't put the car seat in his truck for Kenneth, who was still young enough. He was on a full-size car seat.
Right?
So my father-in-law came up. And that was a whole nother story.
That we won't go into
We
today.
won't go into today. But yeah, I was in the hospital 7 days with 3 kids at home
Well, and
before Tim got home.
right. And so we're talking like, I think Mason and I, we'd only been in El Paso at this point a couple of weeks. Like this is not, I didn't know you before going to the hospital. So I sign up to come to the hospital. So I get up to the hospital. They'd given us like a room number or something. And I knock on the door and I've got Bic pens and the colored clay. And I taught you how to, like, we would pull the ink out and then we would put the clay around the plastic casing of the pen and we rolled it. And then I took them all home and baked them so that the clay would harden. And then we put the ink back in and we had pens that we basically had decorated ourselves. Right, they were cute little pens. And so I brought that to you and you're like, yeah, who are you? And I said, oh, I'm Sarah Westbrook. I don't think at that time you knew that the booby nurse was my husband. Like,
no, that was like, I think I put that together when he came home on R&R. And I was in your kitchen putting dishes away. And Mason was like, that's not where they go. And I was like, dude, I'm in this kitchen all the time. I know where stuff goes.
Right. Well, because shortly after you and I meet, Mason gets deployed
To the same unit
to
Tim
the
was in.
same unit your husband is in. And now we're like, screw this. Like, basically, our husbands were together, and you and I were like, well, we're basically married. And we did dinner at your house one night a week, and then dinner like every other day. We swapped whose house we were doing dinner at. We basically lived at each other's houses. And then in the evenings, we were walking that 2-mile loop every evening with the kids in strollers or in the backpack, or toddler running ahead of us so that they could run out all of their energy. And then you would take Kenneth home and he would sleep for you, and I'd read Eric stories and he'd go to sleep. And that was our deployment.
That was how we functioned.
Right. That was how we functioned. And then I adopted my son Brig while Mason was in Iraq, y'all. So I go out to Washington State and I adopt Brig, and I get off the plane and you meet me at the airport. So I flew home with Brig when he was about 8 days old. And Brig was a tough baby. Like, Eric was tough because I didn't know what to expect. But Brig sucked the life out of me because he would never stop crying. And I came off that plane and you're like, hey, Sarah, how are things going? Like, going to reach my bags and help me out so I can hold the baby. And, you know, Kenneth and Eric were besties. Like, those two were two peas in a pod. Loved each other. We've got pictures of those two peeing in the same toilet while we were potty training
Because we
them.
potty trained them together.
Yeah.
With chocolate.
Well, and then little Michaela told our boys that once they learned how to go potty in the toilet, their penises would fall off and they would turn into girls like her, that she had been born with a penis, and that when she learned how to potty train, then her penis fell off. And so then Eric was starting to potty train, and then he stopped because he didn't want his penis to fall off.
Of course.
Of course. Thank you, Michaela. We love you. So that was another one of our very good friends, kiddos there. But you came to the plane and I literally shoved Brig at you and I was like, here, take him. Because I was
You were done when you got off that plane.
exhausted. That was a long trip. And then our husbands came home January. It was like right after Christmas.
Tim actually came home the 23rd.
Yeah,
He
you
came
suck.
home before because your Christmas lights stayed up until the MPs complained. Because you were not going to take the Christmas lights down until Mason got home.
Well, and Mason got home, I want to say like January 10th or something. I mean, because one of the nice things about being in the military and with little kids, I mean, because Eric, when Mason got home, Eric would have been 3.
Just 3, yeah.
Yeah, and Brig was a newborn. So we didn't have like preschooler schools or anybody telling them when the holidays were. So we just skipped Christmas. We did Christmas during the 2 weeks that Mason had after he got home from Eric. But yeah, Mason came home, I want to say right around the 10th of January. And yes, the MPs came to my house a couple of days before Mason got home and said, you know, you're breaking code. Or whatever the housing thing, these have to come down now. You're getting complaints. And I looked right at him and I said, I will take them down when my husband gets home and we celebrate Christmas together. And, you know, where's your husband? Well, he's in Iraq. Okay. And we didn't have any more issues. Like they were good about it. Once they knew why I was leaving him up. Well, and one of them was like, so when is he coming home?
You're like, well, that's a great question.
Right.
I'd love that answer.
Right. No. And in like 2 weeks. Okay. You can leave him up. So yeah, that was it. Alrighty. So Danny came here to Missouri to visit me before she's a trader and moves even further away from me. So she lives in Plano right now, which is about an 8-hour drive from doorstep to doorstep. We know this because we've taken the trip several times. And Danny's a trader and she's moving to the Northwest coast, which means I'm going to have to go to the airport instead of just get in my car and drive.
Yeah.
And when we were talking, I said, hey, do you want to come on the podcast? We'd kind of tossed around some ideas. Danny specializes in working with the LGBTQ population, specifically teens. She's also a therapist. I did it first, y'all, just so you know.
She did. We've taken turns with our growth.
Also true. Danny left the church before I did. And so anyway, over the years, though, we've done so many things together. We've connected even when the military's kept us separate. Like you were in Georgia, you came to North Carolina. Like we will travel the country to visit each other on a regular basis. And so when you came up yesterday and we were talking about, hey, what do you want to do? What do we want to talk about? We had started out with, we were going to talk about the LGBTQIA population again and some of those implications. And then as we were just chatting over dinner, we were talking about the pressures within the Mormon church of getting married super young, having millions of kids right away, and the impact that we are seeing both on us, where we both started our families very young.
Yes.
And then the differences in that, and then how that's different in what we're seeing in our own children who are now adults, because both of us have
Adult
kiddos and what that looks like. And then also just some of those things that we see in clinic in individuals who are, I'm going to say, it's hard to say forced into marriage because they're not forced, but there's like this
strongly encouraged.
Strongly encouraged. The expectation is there that you will, and if you don't, you're getting shamed or criticized. And we're going to get into some of these quotes. I don't remember who it was. One of them said something about if you weren't married by 25 to the boys, they were a menace to society. So things like that. Was who, Mason? Do you know who that was?
The first time I remember hearing it was from Gordon B. Hinckley, but I was looking earlier and I didn't find it right away, so I'll have to keep looking.
Yeah, I remember because that was, I think, after you and I were married, shortly after, in that time frame. And I was teasing you. I was like, well, it's a good thing you're not a menace to society. Yeah. So today our intent is to talk about and examine how can we reclaim or take back charge of our own life choices, specifically with regards to family planning and major life decisions, because anybody who says getting married is not a major life transition either hasn't been married or doesn't take marriage super serious would be my guess, because it's a huge life transition. And then follow that up with when you start having children.
I was an old maid in my ward growing up, or the ward I was in as a young adult, because I was 21 when I had my first baby.
Yeah.
And I was an old maid having my first baby.
Right.
Because I was 21. I see kids in clinic now and they're 21, 23, and they're like in college, they're still working fun little jobs, and they're developing, they're becoming the people they can be.
Right.
They're still figuring it out. And I was like, you're 23. I had a 2-year-old at 23.
Yeah. I had a 3-year-old at 23. And we had been trying for a while. So Mason and I actually have talked about this story. I don't think we've done it on Unpacking Mormonism, but we've talked about it with people before. So we had been married, I'm going to say 18 months to 2 years. And we knew when we got married that I might have some challenges with pregnancy, because from the time I was 13 and my menstrual period started, I had had issues with bleeding for weeks on end. I think we talked about that. Those medical issues that I was struggling with from the time I started my period when I had my friend Zoe on several weeks ago. And the doctor had told me that they couldn't figure out what was going on. They had prescribed birth control, which I only took for a short period of time because taking birth control, according to my dad, meant he was giving me permission to have sex in high school. So then I stopped taking it because there was a lot of stuff there. But we figured that I might have a difficult time getting pregnant. And so when Mason and I got married, we were married maybe 3 months, and we were like, all right, it's time for us to start a family. Like, we've been married 3 months. This is the normal Mormon standard. So I was 18 years old and 2.5 months when we got married. And Mason, you would have been 22. Right. Yeah, Mason would have been 22. So Mason was starting to dance on being a menace to society because he was not married within 1 year of getting home from your mission, right?
No, that's not true. I was married less than 1 year before I got home from my mission. So,
Wait,
no.
less-
But, and I think that you guys are going to tell your story, and I think this is an incredibly important story because I'm certain that other people get this message. It's not the message I got. I wasn't ever concerned. I know people who got messages from their mission president that they better go home and get married right away. That is your number one goal. I didn't get that message from my mission president, but I know lots of people do. And I think that the concern and the struggle here is this message is being told, and we need to be able to fix that.
Yeah, well, and it's being told pretty frequently today still. In 2022, almost 2023, we're still hearing this message being taught to our kiddos. I think, Mason, one of the reasons your mission president wasn't as pushy on go home and get married was because your mission president was Dale Murphy, the baseball player who was a convert, who had lived his life. Like, he had followed his dreams, pursued his dreams, played baseball. Like, he had a very different experience than most of your Mormon mission presidents coming in, because most of my friends who had gone on missions, that was the message that they got, that their next mission in life was to go home, find the right person, and get married, which is why we joke about BYU being the school for BYU I do. Like, girls go to BYU to get married. Guys go to BYU to get married and get an education. But that was what it was. And that's what my parents did. As soon as my mom was married to my dad, she quit going to school because that was no longer what she was supposed to be doing with her life. She was supposed to have kids, and she did. My parents had me 11 months after they got married. So anyway, so Mason and I are married for about 18 months to 2 years. We had started trying to get pregnant 3 months after we got married, because we had been told that I might struggle with infertility. And my family doctor growing up was correct. I definitely was struggling with some infertility. So at that point, we had done the sperm count test and some saline sonos. I think I'd had 2 surgeries at that point, one exploratory and then one because I had an ovarian cyst that burst, and it burst open my right ovary, and I was bleeding internally. They went in thinking it was a burst appendix, and came out saying, actually, you were bleeding from a burst ovary. And so they stitched the ovary closed and cleaned up all of the blood, and still took my appendix out for me. And so we had been actively trying, and we had gotten, after about a year to a year and a half of infertility treatments, we had gotten to the point where the OBGYN we were working with could not explain why I couldn't get pregnant, but said my next step was in vitro fertilization. And at the time, in vitro fertilization was more expensive. I actually think in vitro fertilization back then is more expensive than it is today. I think it's one of those few things that has come down, because I remember we started talking and we said we could spend, I'll just say $25,000 on in vitro fertilization, and it might work, but it might not, and there was no way to get that money back. Or we could go through an adoption and spend the money and we'd get a baby at the end. And so we chose adoption because my doctor said, we don't know why you can't get pregnant, but we also don't think your uterus is going to hang on to a baby. There's too much scar tissue in here, so on and so forth. And so we opted for adoption, and we started our adoption through a foreign adoption. So there was a lady in our ward who had adopted several children out of Russia. And so she got us hooked up with an agency or whatever, and we started the process of adopting through the Ukraine, and then come to find out the agency that we got hooked up with was fraudulent. And we lost our dossier, so we had to put together this huge packet of papers, legal papers, home studies, all kinds of things to demonstrate that we were capable parents. So basically, it's like the international home study process. And then you have to put that all through like some customs and immigration, something or other. And our dossier was destroyed and we would have to start over, and we were $8,000 in. So we were grieving the loss of the 2 children that we were trying to adopt out of the Ukraine. And subsequently, side note, one of the things, we were trying to adopt a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old out of the Ukraine. And one of the concerns that we both had, Mason, if you remember, was that the 3-year-old would be older, would have been born before the year we got married. And we were concerned that people were going to think that you and I had a baby before getting married. And we were concerned what that might do for us moving forward. And so we were kind of like postponing a little bit on that because we didn't want the perception that
You'd had a baby out of
we'd had a
wedlock.
baby out of wedlock. So our timing with all of that would have been, we'd have been picking up 3-year-old right about the time that we'd have been getting married and whatnot. Yeah. So that was a concern for us as well. So we're about 2 years into our marriage. I'm struggling with depression and feelings of failure of infertility. And there is a visiting general authority that's coming to our stake to speak. And he was a high up in the general authorities. He was higher up than Mason, you said you thought that he was a president of the 70 or something, or within the 70s presidency. But anyway, so not an apostle, but definitely
Pretty high up.
pretty established and well known in the 70s. And I do not remember who it was. I would have to go back and I don't even know where we would figure out who it was that was visiting. But it was a visiting general authority in northeastern Arizona. So we were in the Pinetop Lakeside Stake at the time. And we did the adult meeting. So when a general authority comes to visit, you have your leadership meeting middle of the afternoon, and then you would have your adults only meeting on a Saturday evening. And then you had the stake conference with families meeting Sunday morning. And then we were done. I don't know what else they did. But that was the thing for us. So Mason had attended the leadership meeting, and then we were attending the adult meeting. And at the end of that general authority's talk and the meeting, we formed a receiving line, and the members of the congregation could walk up onto the stand, shake the general authority's hand, share a few words, walk off, go get some cookies, and then go home. And so Mason and I join this receiving line, and we get up to the general authority and shake his hand, and we introduce ourselves. We're Sarah and Mason Westbrook. We're obviously very young, y'all. It's not hard to pinpoint a 20-year-old and a 24-year-old out of a lineup. We were pretty young. And so he asked us, how long have you guys been married? And we told him, I'm just going to say 2 years. We've been married 2 years. And he said, wonderful. How many children do you have? And we said, well, we don't have any yet. And then he looked down at my stomach, and I was obviously not pregnant. I was skinny as a stick at that point. I was so petite. And then he chastised us for procrastinating having children. And he told us that the Lord had commanded us not to procrastinate having children, and that if we didn't fix it, we were sinning, and that we needed to get on it, that it needed to be our primary focus.
That's insane. You were 20. Your brain was not done developing.
Right. Well, and we had been
And you'd been trying.
Right. Here I am standing in front of a general authority that I think can speak directly for God, telling me that I'm sinning and that I'm wrong for not being able to have a baby. I was devastated. And Mason, what was your thought? I remember you being shocked. Did you have any other thoughts when he did that?
You're asking me to remember something from 20 years ago?
Yes.
I don't. My thoughts now are just that I think that we allow people that we respect in our lives, in this case we're talking about the church, so leaders in the church, but high demand religions, people we respect in our lives, we allow them too much leniency to make judgment calls on where we are. And I think that as you've just shared, that can be very hurtful.
Well, yeah, because I'm expecting him speaking for God. I'm expecting that the Lord would have told him. If he had said, the Lord wants you to know that a baby is coming soon, I'd have been all about that.
Oh, yeah.
Like, thank you. That's revelation. That brings me peace. But he didn't. He chastised us for procrastinating when we had been diligently trying to have a baby since 3 months after we had gotten married. We did not get cookies that night. I know all of you are sitting at the edge of your seat wondering if we left the receiving line and got our cookies before going home, and we did not. I remember grabbing Mason by the wrist and pulling him out of the building, ignoring everybody. We got to our car to drive home, and as soon as I was in the passenger side of our little Ford it was a Ford Contour that we were driving at the time. We sat down. Mason got in the driver's seat. I was in the passenger seat. And as soon as we got into that car, I burst into tears and was crying so hard. I remember like dry heaving, making myself nauseous because a representative of the Lord Jesus Christ had just yelled at me for not having something that God was not giving me. It was awful.
Ouch.
Yeah.
That's horrid.
It really is. If you think about it, this man, I mean, keep your mouth shut, sir. You don't know. This is that unsolicited advice, y'all, except that in the Mormon church, at least, if it's coming from somebody in a position of high authority,
it's God's word.
It's God's word. It's expected. You're allowed to give me unsolicited advice, not knowing anything about my life, and I'm expected to follow it.
Yeah.
And take it as direct revelation. So needless to say, that gentleman was wrong. I have a really hard time not calling him an asshole. My guess is that he was doing the best job that he knew how to do at the time. And I know that he didn't have an intention to hurt me, but it was a really short-sighted comment. And I know that a lot of our non-Mormon listeners are going to say, well, why would somebody even say that? So Danny, you and I sat down in our planning meeting and we came up with a couple of things. What did your search find when you were looking at where did this come from?
Let me pull a screenshot back up so I have an idea of what I was looking at. I was looking at a website that was Ask a Mormon Mom or something. Library. Screenshot. So it was, why do Mormons have large families? And this is written from the perspective of a Mormon mom. And she says, because we want them. We believe that we're called to give bodies to spirit children. We believe it's a commandment of God. Just basically that it is the most sacred duty of a woman to get married and have babies.
Yeah. Well, and I would say that anybody that's coming out of the Mormon system got that message to varying degrees.
Oh, yeah.
In mine, I've got Elder Oaks, so Dallin H. Oaks, from May 1st, 2005, speaking to the young single adults. And he, in this talk, claims that delaying marriage past the age of 25 is a sign that you're mentally immature. And my thought is, if I'm mentally immature, I probably shouldn't be getting married.
And why are we going to give you responsibility for small people? They take a lot of energy and nurturing and guidance.
Right. Well, and Dallin H. Oaks then in the same talk goes on and tells the boys, if you are not coming home from your missions and actively seeking a spouse and pairing off as soon as you find one, and the way that he worded it was, when one meets the qualifications of being worthy and whatnot, then you need to pair off with that person and start dating them with the intent of getting married. And he's talking to 20 and 21-year-olds, telling them that if they're not doing this, it's time for them to grow up and start doing this. And then for the girls, he quoted his 18-year-old granddaughter and said something like the 3 Ps is, how do you know it's a date? Well, there's 3 Ps. You prepare ahead, you pay for it. So guys, you got to pay for it. And 3, purposeful pairing off.
And that's so not what I think of now. When I think of dating now, it's getting to know a person, deciding if you even want to spend time with them, not just, do I want to marry them?
Right. You have brown hair, you're skinny, you go to church every Sunday.
I should definitely marry you.
I need to marry you right now. Let's do this. Like, I'm going to start dating you. Right. Exactly. Well, and in this same talk, Oaks is discouraging people from group dates and socializing activities that are not looking for a spouse, calling those a waste of time. When we look at things from a mental and relationship health status, those are the types of activities we want our young people engaged in so that they can learn what they like and what they don't like. Mason, you had tapped me on the shoulder. Do you want to chime in here?
I don't know if I can remember still.
Sorry.
Just kidding. I just wanted to point out that, and I would be interested to see exactly what this quote says, so let's make sure we put it in the notes. But the idea that if you're not married at a certain point in time, it shows that you're emotionally immature or whatever is a shame statement. And that's really just what I want to point out, is that this is not a statement meant to build people into better people. It's a statement that is meant to shame you into a decision that maybe you're not ready for. Whether or not you're actually mature enough for marriage, if you don't feel mature enough for marriage, or someone's giving you the message that you're not mature enough for marriage, that's a shame statement.
Well, and maybe because I would say my son Brig is 18 and he is not ready to get married. And that's not meant to shame or be hurtful to Brig at all. My 21-year-old, I feel like if he found the right person and he felt comfortable, I would trust him to be able to do that. But my oldest has told me a number of times, I'm not even interested in looking yet. I've got some more growing up to do. And if he feels that way, I honor that. And I want to make it very clear. I'm not discouraging never get married when you're young. Hell, I was 18 when I got married and things have turned out okay. I mean, I kind of like you, Mason. But rather, we need to stop pressuring people to make these major life choices on some arbitrary timeline based on really no significant evidence other than that's what the prophets have been saying for a really long time.
Right. I simply just want to point out that the way the statement was made by a leader of the church directed at young men who've not gotten married yet was made, it's a shame statement. It's meant to push somebody into a decision whether or not they're ready for it. And that's what I think the danger is. Not so much that you get married young, you don't get married young. Some people are ready for it, some people aren't. Certainly some people, even if they're not ready for it, are going to do their best to make sure that it works out. The point is that if you're pressuring people into a decision that is certainly an important decision, you're not going to end up with good results, at least all the time.
I would say it's a boundary issue. Danny, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, I have lots of 18 to 23-year-old clients, okay? Some of them are not ready even for community college because they don't know where they're going.
Right.
They need that time to grow up.
Right.
My 20-year-old and I just had a discussion the other night, and he was telling me, you know, everybody says this is the time in life I need to be preparing for my retirement. I need to be, you know, he's not old enough to put money in a 401k yet. Like HR told him, you are not old enough. Like you have to be 21 to put money in a 401k.
He can put money in a Roth IRA though.
He can, but he's doing some other stuff and saving for a house because that's what his life goal at this point is to own his own house.
Right. Well, and most of our kiddos this age cannot get employment with a livable income yet. Like
No.
in today's day and age, we're expecting our youth to get married super young, have babies right away. They can't even afford to feed themselves half the time. I love them, but come on.
We have a bonus 20-year-old that holds down a full-time job, and they are not able to afford an apartment.
Right.
So they're renting a room from us,
Right.
which is awesome. But they are still playing video games and being a kid.
Well, and we're supposed to, one of the things, Danny, you and I talked about earlier was our developmental ages and stages. High school is when the world starts to revolve around us, and young adulthood is the natural stage where we begin to come out of that and recognize our choices impact other people. Not everything is about me. And having babies in that developmental age stage does not change your cognitive development just because, it can for women a little bit. We see in the research that a woman who gets pregnant and has a baby will have some rapid development. I think that's nature taking care of to make sure, the species does not die off. But men do not get that same hormonal burst just because they now have a child. It doesn't work that way.
It doesn't.
So now we have very young males who have a difficult time recognizing how their choices impact the people around them. So Mason, you had asked for that quote from Dallin H. Oaks. So the piece that I screenshotted here, and I did email you the source material. It's in your inbox. Mason did not join us for the planning meeting, y'all, because he's on call today. And so he has not yet checked his email to see that we got all the source material. But this is what Dallin H. Oaks said, quote, "Men, if you've returned from your mission," so and at the time this was 2005, so that would have been 21-year-olds. So men, if you've returned from your mission and you are still following the boy-girl patterns you were counseled to follow when you were 15, it is time for you to grow up. So remember, in Mormonism, prior to age 15, you're not allowed to date. Right. But this is, yeah. So 16, you're allowed to date, but it's supposed to be group dates, and you're not supposed to steady date or single date anybody. So that means I always have other people with me, which I don't think is bad advice at all. I think group dating and whatnot when you're in those years is pretty healthy. But there's for girls anyway, from 16 to 18 group date. But as soon as you're 18, pair off, get married. That's kind of the pressure I got. And for our men, it's group date until you're home from your mission, pair off and get married. So I actually have a really good friend of mine that says the Mormon church teaches people to cheat on each other, because the natural inclination is when you meet somebody that you connect with, you naturally will pair off with them, get to know them better. And as that's healthy and good for you, you stay paired off. And when it gets uncomfortable and unhealthy, you naturally break those ties. That's part of the natural process. So in Mormonism, it's like if you have a connection with somebody, you still have to date all these other people. And their theory is that Mormons actually train their youth to cheat based on forcing them to do this unnatural connection or pairing off. Yeah, I have no research to back it, but I have a really good friend that said that once. So, alrighty. So then Dallin H. Oaks says, it's time for you to grow up. Gather your courage and look for someone to pair off with. Start with a variety of dates with a variety of young women. And when that face yields a good prospect, proceed to courtship. It's marriage time. That is what the Lord intends for his young adult sons and daughters. Men have the initiative, and you men should get on with it. If you don't know what a date is, perhaps this definition will help. I heard it from my 18-year-old granddaughter. A quote-unquote date must pass the test of 3 Ps. Number 1, planning ahead. Number 2, paid for. And number 3, paired off. And it was earlier up in that where he talked about postponing marriage being a sign of delayed maturity. So, did you have anything you wanted to add, Mason? How about you, Danny?
Just as having grown up with that, and that was the expectation, I look back on it now with adult and young adult kiddos. And I'm like, oh my God, that's horrid.
Yeah.
Like, it's so much pressure on somebody who, like, when do you get to enjoy life if you do that? When do you get to figure out who you are? When we met, we were both good little Mormon girls.
You were pioneer woman.
I was definitely pioneer woman.
More like you had
I ground my wheat every morning to make bread for my family.
for the day.
For the day. Yeah.
And bagels and cookies and food storage and canning. And you lived in your kitchen with your kids in a sling, riding on you and nursing on you. Like,
absolutely. I did baby wearing.
Barefoot and nursing.
Forever. I still don't like shoes. I have them on now because it's cold up here.
It is cold here. It's like 20 degrees outside.
Yeah, that's why I have wool socks and boots on.
People in Alaska are laughing at us. It's not cold there. Or it's not cold here compared to there.
I lived in Alaska. I also wore wool socks there.
Okay.
Anyway, I did it. I lived it. I breathed it. I was doing the things I was told would bring my husband and me an eternal life of glory and joy. And these were all the right things to do.
Right.
But I look back, I am so not that person. Tim and I just celebrated our 21st wedding anniversary. Our marriage is old enough to drink.
Yay.
But we are such different people. And for me, when we got married, so Tim's my second husband. I got married at 19. I got divorced at 25 and remarried at 26, I think. Somewhere along those lines.
Right.
So Tim had that 19-year-old moved out of his parents' house to 26 to figure out who he was, what he liked, what he didn't like, to grow up, to have to be responsible for buying toilet paper. I mean, like, all the pieces of becoming an adult.
I have to laugh when you say responsible enough to buy toilet paper, because when I was helping Brig do his grocery order today and I was like, do you need toilet paper? He's like, no, I don't know. I'm not spending money on that. I was like, yes, you are.
But I got married at 19 the first time.
Right.
We met at 18. We got married at 19. Everybody I knew, because we were good little Mormons, everybody I knew, you got married and you had babies or you had infertility issues. Mm-hmm. There was no other choice.
Right. It was you try to have a baby. And if you are not actively trying to build your family through having children, you are sinning.
And you're selfish.
Yes, you're selfish.
It was so much shame.
Yeah.
And then it was so much celebration when we were pregnant. And I had started college. Mm-hmm. I had a sister in my ward say to me, well, that's something nice to do while you're preparing to have children. Mm-hmm. And now you're pregnant. So why are you enrolling for next semester?
Right. My mom took the how to become a good homemaker major that they have at BYU. And then once she got married and was pregnant with me, she stopped because now she was whatever. And I know that my mom worked at a convenience store to try and put my dad through school and make ends meet. Like, they were broke. They were so broke. So one of the things that I've got in our source material that goes along with that, Danny, is so in 1970s, because one of the things that we get when we podcast on this is a lot of members going, the church never taught that. And I'm like, yes, I did. Here you go.
I did.
Elder Bruce R. McConkie, who was then a member of the 70, taught, quote, from the moment of birth into mortality to the time we are married in the temple, everything we have in the whole gospel system is to prepare and qualify us to enter that holy order of matrimony. There is nothing in this world as important as the creation and perfection of family units. And so this is what was taught. By the time I was born, all the way up until I married Mason, the focus was get Sarah ready to get married. not get Sarah ready to be an adult, to take care of herself. Like, I do not remember sitting down with my parents and learning how to pay bills or balance a checkbook or develop a meal plan and go grocery shopping. And literally, I got married to Mason. It was like, all right, well, you're married. We did it. Figure out the rest on your own,
Now,
but you better have a baby soon.
In Young Women's, I ran across it the other day cleaning out old stuff that Pops had sent me. I have my recipe book I put together, and in the back of it, my Young Women's advisor had taught us how to take a recipe and turn your recipe into a grocery list, because that was a skill I evidently needed at 13.
Fantastic. See, but I teach my kids that skill at 13. Like, in the summertime, my kids, we say, okay, what meal do you want to prepare for the family this week? Okay, so you need that. Go to your thing. How do you get a grocery list? Okay, how much do your groceries cost? Here's your budget. You get your $25 budget or whatever to prepare your one meal. So my kids learn that. But I was not taught that type of a skill in my home, because the focus for me, at least, was my mom was pairing me off and matchmaking me to little kids across the street. I remember I was in kindergarten when my mom was saying things like, I would just love it if Sarah married that little boy because he's so nice. And I was like, he just pushed me down on the trampoline. I am not marrying him. And I had to laugh. I think was it yesterday, Mason? Abby came home. No, yesterday was Saturday. So Abby came home from school on Friday, and apparently an 11-year-old kid at school asked her if she would marry him. And she was like, excuse me, I am way too young for that. And I was laughing because when I was little, having a little boy ask me to marry him, my mom would have been like, oh, yay. And for Abby, I just laughed. I was like, well, you definitely told him, didn't you? She goes, I don't even know what he was thinking. Who gets married at 11? So, Mason, you looked like you were going to say something. No? Okay. So then the other thing that I've got one more quote that really goes into the babies thing. Let me find it. Okay. So this one is the teachings of Ezra Taft Benson. And
I think he was a prophet when I was a youth. I'm not sure on the timeline, but I remember that being... Yeah. So he
85
was a prophet,
to 94.
Literally the entire, because I finished 6th grade in 85.
Yeah.
So all the way through high school.
Benson was the first prophet that I remember listening to. So I think Kimball was the prophet when I was born, but Benson is the first prophet I have memory of. So in the teachings of Ezra Taft Benson on page 541, it says this. This is a direct quote from Ezra Taft Benson. Brigham Young emphasized there are multitudes of pure and holy spirits waiting to take tabernacles. Now, what is our duty? So when he says that there are multitudes of pure and holy spirits waiting to take tabernacles, you have to jump back into the Mormon teaching that there's a pre-existence, and that in that pre-existence, there's a whole bunch of spirits waiting to come down to earth and get their bodies. And so when he says this, to take tabernacles, he's basically referring to spirits need to come down and get their bodies. Now, what is our duty? To prepare tabernacles for them, to take a course that will not tend to drive those spirits into the families of the wicked, where they will be trained in wickedness, debauchery, and every species of crime. It is the duty of every righteous man and woman to prepare tabernacles for all the spirits they can. So this is where we get that idea of Mormons need to have a whole bunch of babies, because it is our responsible to make sure as many of those pre-existing spirit babies, humans waiting to join us on earth, it is our duty to make sure as many as we can possibly get into our home to protect them from the evils of the world is of the utmost importance. That's what this quote is saying. Mason, would you disagree with me on that quote?
Nope.
He's over there playing with his Rubik's Cube.
And I'm sitting here listening to this many years out of the Mormon church and many years of mental health training and going, are you kidding me?
Right?
Like, I was taught that. I was indoctrinated with that.
Yeah.
That my whole purpose in life was to have babies. Not to have a career, not to even have a relationship with my spouse. Like, that was not even the focus. The focus was get married and have babies. Nothing about how to be a good spouse.
Right?
I wasn't taught that.
How to communicate with your spouse.
Yeah.
How to enjoy sex with your spouse. Like, it is missionary style sex and get pregnant. That's the purpose.
That's
of
your
sex.
purpose.
It wasn't until I want to say about 10 years ago that I heard a talk say that sex can be incredibly connective and for the procreation of children. Like, when I was young, it was you have sex so you can have babies. And it's the most sacred power because it is the only power on earth where a man and woman can act like the gods and create humans.
And I never heard that from the pulpit.
Nope.
Because I left the church more than 10 years ago.
Lucky you. Alrighty. Well, and to go off on that, or to build on what you just said, Danny, again, in that Teachings of Ezra Taft Benson on page 546, he says, since the beginning, a woman's first and most important role has been ushering into mortality spirit sons and daughters of our Father in heaven. Since the beginning, her role has been to teach her children eternal gospel principles. And then I screenshotted it, and I don't get the bottom of it, which is like she is to provide for her. But if my memory is serving correctly, it's like provide for her husband. Like, her job is get married, have as many babies as she possibly can, and then provide for them, raise them, and meet her husband's every need, because his job is to make sure that he's getting her pregnant as often as possible, and then work himself to the bone to support those children and give all of his free time to the church. Like, when I was growing up, did you ever get a message, Danny, that family vacation and fun time and that type of stuff was important?
No, I can remember our bishop and our youth leaders taking their PTO to go on youth trips in the summer. So we had enough adults that we were completely chaperoned.
Yeah, I don't remember getting that message either, that it was the vacation was important, family. Certainly the message that family time is important. I'm looking through this Teachings of Ezra Taft Benson. He has lots of good points about how to make family life valuable, but yes, not that, I guess the idea that you have to balance your family duties with your church duties as well. And of course, that vacation doesn't fit into that very well.
Right. It was family home evening. Monday nights is reserved for family time.
Yeah. And you better make it work. That absolutely, that was the way it was supposed to be. But the other piece of that is when you're talking about get married young, start having babies, have lots of babies. So you're getting married at 18. You're having babies for 20 years. So you got 8-10 kids. So you're 40, you're 40, 45, having your last kid. You're 60 by the time all your kids are out of the house. You've been married to somebody for 35, 40 years. You've never lived alone with them when you weren't pregnant.
Right. Or the time that you lived alone with them prior to getting pregnant is less than a year.
Yeah. Because you were supposed to get married, never go on birth control.
Well, see, and so I know for me, because I remember I specifically looked that up as a youth because my dad claimed that birth control was like giving me permission to have sex. And that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me because the doctor gave me the birth control so that I would stop bleeding to death.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I found in the handbook at that time was that birth control was to be used, for medical purposes and sparingly. And that the idea of no birth control, that birth control is bad, was more of a Catholic thing. But it did bleed into,
I think,
Mormonism.
Like, that was just the message I absorbed, was that birth control was bad. You should have babies. And I had youth leaders. I remember the lady in our ward that had 12 kids.
Yeah.
And when I look back to my early married life, I don't remember the first year of my oldest's life. I remember some medical complications, and I remember sitting and crying and nursing him. And I was married to a 19-year-old. So neither of us, well, I guess he would have been 21 also at the time. We were pretty close in age. Neither of us knew that that wasn't okay.
Right.
For me to, because we were doing the quote, right things. So I was staying home with the baby and cooking and cleaning and baby and all that good stuff in my church callings. And he was going to work every day.
Right.
And coming home, and neither of us knew that that wasn't okay.
Right.
When I had my younger kids, I was married to my second husband, who I'm still married to, and he was like, this is not okay. You can't sit and cry every day. We are taking you to the doctor. But he had that time as an adult to develop before we got married.
Right. Well, and one of the things that we see in the statistics, like if we're looking at DSHS cases and the significant child abuse cases, we do see those in older adults to their children. But the number one population for like physical abuse and neglect are in our very young parents. And I think a lot of that's because, as you said earlier, Danny, their frontal cortexes are not done developing before they are tasked with survival of these small children. And when we're coming out of a church system that puts that is, again, they don't force you, but to go outside, it's like we've got this prescribed way of doing things. And if you say, you know what, I'm not quite ready to get married when I'm 19, I think I'd like to wait until I'm mid to late 20s, and I'll probably start my family in my 30s. And then suddenly you have all these people at church going, no, that's not right. That's not good. That's bad. It's difficult if you're in this culture to break free of that. And as Mason said, to work through the consistent shaming and question. I mean, for those years that Mason and I were struggling with infertility until Eric came home with us, we had to talk to Mason's family who knew that we were struggling with infertility. Random people that we didn't know from Adam advising us and telling us that we were waiting too long to start our family. I was 20 years old when we legally adopted Eric. The judge was shocked at our age because the average age for couples to be adopting children are like late 20s to mid 30s and into your mid 40s.
Yeah.
Like I was incredibly young. So was Mason. But I mean, 24, Mason was at least closer to the normal age of people doing that. But Mason's frontal cortex wasn't fully developed till he was 23. How do I know that? Because he's a guy. And that's what science does, right? And mine would have finished developing in my early 20s. So 18, 19, 20 is when mine's finishing out. I mean, we increase the risk of neglect and abuse and all of these other things, but you're also locking individuals into these responsibilities. Like growing up, I was told that if I had babies, I would be joyous. It would be my greatest happiness. I would get the blessings and the love of the Lord, that my home would be filled with love and peace. I do not know what the hell the matter is with these men telling me this, but I got 7 kids and my home is rarely peaceful.
Well, what they don't tell you is what your home is actually filled with is dirty dishes, dirty diapers,
Vomit,
sick
piss, kids,
shit, all of these things that come with children,
tantrums,
everywhere.
crying, sleep deprivation, redirection, training, school activities, taxi cab driving. I mean, it is.
When I talk,
it's consuming, and I love my kids. I would not give a single one of them away. I truly love my children. I think I would have made some different decisions in how I plan or how I had them and when I had them and their age differences if I had been trained to think 20 years into the future and say, do you want this? One of the things that you and I had talked about, Danny, in the planning meeting is my second child had severe mental illness. And I love, Hayden, Katie, and Landon, would not trade them in for anything. But I felt obligated to continue to have more and more children, even though I was literally drowning in. Brig never slept. You were there.
I remember you calling me and saying, I need you to come get Brig and Eric and keep them because the doctor said he's going to put me in the hospital if I don't give my kids to somebody and go home and sleep because I'm so sleep deprived. And I went and got them.
I was so sleep deprived. The chronic lack of sleep had been going on for so long that I was getting like peripheral vision hallucinations. Like I kept feeling like dark objects were coming at me out of my peripheral vision. And I went to the doctor. I was like, I think I'm going crazy. Like I'm seeing things that aren't there. And his first question was, how well are you sleeping? And I was like, well, I'm not. I've got this kid who never sleeps. Like I haven't slept more than maybe 6 hours in the last 2 weeks. And he was, you have to sleep. And I was like, well, I'm sorry. My husband's in Iraq. What do you want me to do?
And you brought your kids over to me and you slept like 36 hours.
Yeah. You checked on me at 18.
I did because I was worried that you had died. That was my biggest fear was you were going to die and I was going to be left with 5 children until Mason could come home from Iraq. And the Army had just proven to me earlier that year, I was in the hospital. They gave me a 50-50 chance to live. And it took them 7 days to get my husband home. So I was like, well, if she actually dies, they're going to say he doesn't have to come home because I have the kids. And now I'm going to be single parenting these 5 children we have been co-parenting.
Right.
But I love my children. I would not trade any of them for anything in the world.
Right.
But when my oldest came home, the youngest, because she moved out at 18 and then came back at like 24-ish after going to school, living with friends, being on their own, the whole 9 yards. And my youngest did something. And I was like, that is unacceptable in our home. You go sit in your room until dinner. I'm finished making dinner. And you think about how you could have better done that. And Amber looked at me and said, you would have beat me. Mm-hmm. Now, I never beat my children, right. But their impression of, 2 swats on the butt with my hand was I had beat them.
Right. Well, because if you're having kids when you're 18, 19, before your frontal cortex is developed, usually your brain is in a place of, you have to do what I say because this is how I want it. You don't have the emotional cognitive understanding that, oh, this is a normal part of pediatric development. Like I remember I'd have been really young and Eric had an ear infection or something and had a fever. And of course, I call the military's telehealth line. I'm like, yeah, he's got a fever of like 102.5. And instead of them telling me, well, you need to go get some Tylenol or Motrin at, Walgreens or something, whatever, and keep him uncovered. Like I'm a first-time mom. I don't know what the hell I'm doing.
Right.
It was go to the emergency room. We took this kid to the emergency room. They gave him Tylenol and fluids and sent me home. And they were like, why did you come here instead of giving him Tylenol and Motrin? And I was like,
because I didn't know.
I didn't know. I had no idea. I think, having a new baby, Eric was normal pediatric stuff, stuffy nose, ear infection, that kind of stuff. I'd been pretty healthy. Like, I didn't even know how to go to the doctor. I remember my very first doctor's appointment with Eric after Mason joined the military. I didn't even know about insurance. Like we had TRICARE and I paid cash. And then the doctor came out and said, didn't your husband just join the military? And I said, yes. And she said, use your TRICARE. I don't even know how to do that. Yeah. I had no idea.
We were so young.
Yeah.
And I am such a better parent to my younger kiddo who's 14 now. Mm-hmm. Because I was a grown-up when he was born.
Right.
I mean, we were going through some shit. We had just come back from our year in Alaska, which that was the year from hell. We had, my husband partially severed his arm. The house caught on fire was the final straw. The house flooded. The generator blew up.
I was going to say, didn't your house catch on fire twice?
Yes. It was a very bad year. And we had a totally unsupportive command. They literally told my husband, if your wife calls you again to come home, we're going to make you live in the barracks.
Wow.
I was like, how is that going to solve the problem of the fact that my kids are freezing to death? Literally, we were in Alaska. It was minus 20 something.
Right.
So we had just come out of that when I had Ray.
Yeah.
And it was still such a better experience because I was an adult having a baby, not a baby having a baby.
Yeah, I remember. I'm going to take that. For me, when I had Brig, so I was young, fully formed frontal cortex. So I would have been 23 when we adopted Brig. And I struggled with his special needs. I did not know what to do. I did not know how to advocate for myself. I was very emotionally volatile. Fast forward to Abigail, who Abby is 9 right now. I would have been 32 when we took custody of Abby. I was overwhelmed. I was afraid that somebody was going to take her away from me because we had just lost our twins. But when it came to the sleepless nights, the feeding schedules, the medical complications that she was struggling with, when I took her to the emergency room the first time because she was struggling to breathe, she'd gotten really bad RSV and had to be admitted for supportive care. I was relaxed. I was calm. I was able to go in and say, baby's having a hard time breathing because, I probably this respiratory thing. And then a few weeks or months later was when she started having her seizures, which were due to drug exposure in utero. But at that point in my life, those little normal life events did not overwhelm me and throw me into this place of complete chaos and shutdown because I had the maturity and the emotional and physical development to provide for Abigail much better. Abby has a lot of very similar challenges as Brig does, but Abby is managing those much better. And a lot of that is because I know how to show up for her. I didn't know how to show up for Brig. Mason's raising his hand.
I have another thought after that. I'll write it down.
Well, I just want to say I really appreciate the stories. I think they're very helpful. I think that you've established your point. So maybe it's time to move on and talk about, where do we go from here? I think that the concern for me is that it's not about whether or not you're prepared for having kids. My story is different. If I had not been pushed into having kids, I don't know if we'd have kids. And I'm not okay with that thought process because just like you guys have both said, I love my children. I'm grateful for all the things that I've learned from them and the love that I have for them. So everybody's story is a little different. Some people felt pushed into it. Some people needed to get pushed into it. Some of us struggle more with selfishness than others. And so it's not really, in my opinion, not really about when we're getting married or when we're having kids. It's more about being able to decide for ourselves without abstract pressures coming from people who are not intimately involved in our lives. And I think that's, for me, that's kind of an important issue. But again, I think that you guys have established that there's a lot of struggle that goes along with not being ready, not being prepared, and still being in a situation like that. So maybe if Danny can share her thought and we can move to the part that helps us to understand where to go from here.
So what you've just got caught in is the vortex of Sarah and Danny talking about things
Forever.
for hours and hours and hours. I do want to touch though, Mason, when you said, I don't think I would have kids if I had been pushed into it. I disagree with you. I think you would have, but I think that when we started, you just weren't ready. And that natural not yet was a part of who you were. And I wonder how you might have responded differently if that pressure had not been there. If you had, because when we had Eric, you didn't know yet what you wanted to do with your life. Like it wasn't until after we had Eric that you were finally able to say, okay, I want to pursue a degree in nursing anesthesia. And then we decided to join the military and so on and so forth. Before that, you were still in the brain space of wanting to be the next Garth Brooks and having a baby while you were still working out the kinks of, is this really what I want to do? Is this, a valid place for me? It makes sense that your brain would say not ready for a baby because I'm not where I am ready to do that, logistically speaking.
I think the other thing, kind of circling back to where you were before and how we talked about what different parents we were to our older and our younger kiddos, is we both went and got master's degrees in psychoeducation for all intents and purposes. I'm a social worker. You're an LPC. We spent 6-8 years in school learning how humans work.
Uh-huh.
How awesome would it have been to do that straight out of high school
Right?
and have all that knowledge base when we're given these tiny children, infants, however we get them?
Right.
Because we both really suck at pregnancy, so that should not happen
No
again.
pregnancy for me.
No more. We fixed that.
We both did.
We did. But how different before we were given these tiny little beings that I now have a firm, what I say is when you have a child, it's a choice. Mm-hmm. And you are making a covenant with yourself, that other parent, if there's another parent involved, and the universe to raise this child until they are a competent adult.
Yeah.
And so you are committing minimum 18 years, maybe longer,
Right.
to this small human. And I didn't even have a concept of what 20 years was when I was 19, because that was longer. I was committing to raising a child almost longer than I'd been alive.
Oh, yeah. You absolutely
Certainly
were.
longer than I remember. Now, you tell me you're making a 20-year commitment, I got a grasp on what that is.
Right. Absolutely.
So I think getting the education piece first, giving our young women, our young men, the ability to figure out what they want to do, and giving them the time and space to go to school, whether it be trade school, college, whether they just want to work at Starbucks.
On the job training.
Whatever.
Yeah, right. Find yourself. Well, and I think, when we talk about shifting into, so how do we reclaim our voice when it comes to family planning? I would say that we can't love somebody else more than we love ourselves. Like there's a lot of research that's gone into that, in that I can't give somebody else more than I'm able to give myself. And so as we're trying to reclaim our voice, number one, we need to recognize that there is no one right way to do this. Like in my field, Danny, I know that you have seen this as well. I've seen gay and lesbian couples adopt children and do a phenomenal job of raising these children to become competent, healthy, happy individuals who are able to take care of themselves and be productive citizens. We can go outside of this prescribed norm. There's nothing in this world that says if you don't get married by the time you are 21, you're a failure to society, or a menace to society, I think is what Gordon B. Hinckley had said. If you're not married by the time you're 25, men, you're a menace to society. And I'm looking at most 25-year-olds going, they are at that point probably just stepping into their careers where they're able to know better who they are, be responsible with most of their choices, have that emotional insight to respond to where they're emotionally ready to be daddies.
Yeah.
So, or even partners. Because again, I remember growing up, it was get married, but there was no education on how do we facilitate partnership within a committed relationship. So we've got to be able to recognize that these timelines are very arbitrary and that one size does not fit all. There are lots of people who got married young, had kids young, and rocked it. And to those people, way to go.
Hats off.
Yeah,
You go.
hats off to you. And there are other people who don't start their families till their late 30s and 40s, and that works for them and for whatever reason. So we really need to eliminate judging others for making decisions differently than we did. You know, just because I got married at 18 and somebody else got married at 26 does not mean that I'm better or smarter or anything. It just means I got married at 18, you got married at 26, and that's just the way things go.
I think what comes to my mind, because I was raised in the Mormon church and in the military culture, both of which tell you get married young.
They can
have
make you
babies
dumber.
quickly. Yes, it can.
Right.
I swear pregnancy sucks brain cells.
Because in the military, if you're married, you make more money.
Yes.
And you don't have to live in the barracks.
And how do you say to a 20-year-old, your husband's going to war? Worst case scenario, sweetheart, he may die.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you going to do? You're going to get pregnant before he leaves, so you have something to hold on to.
Mm-hmm.
Intellectually, I understand that. Emotionally, I understand it. But oh my God. Anyway, so I was raised very much Mormon and military.
Yeah.
That was what you did. You got married young. You had babies quickly.
Right.
As an adult, I met this other couple. They are real similar in age to Tim and I. They have one kiddo. He's Ray's age.
Wow.
They got married.
So that puts baby at like 14, 15?
Yeah.
Okay.
He is, I want to say, I passed maternity clothes on to her. So they're like maybe 6 months apart in age. So
Okay.
he's like 8th, 9th grade.
Alrighty.
But she's my age, so she's almost 50 or right at 50. So she had first kiddo in her late 30s. She has a career that she's not just starting at 50.
Mm-hmm.
She's...
A retirement.
Yeah. I mean,
Fund,
like
right.
all those real adult things that we were raised that those were man things. Men had retirement.
Right. I was taught, have babies, raise those babies, take care of your husband, and you'll be fine. And it took a while for me to go, if my husband dies, I'm screwed. I have no marketable skill. I have no job experience. I have no retirement. I will become dependent on either the government, my family, or the church. Or
Yeah,
go
or
find
find another
myself
husband.
another husband.
So
Preferably a bazillionaire.
definitely.
Elon Musk, here I come.
But when I met this other woman, and she was my age, and she had a career. She and her husband had traveled the world together.
Right, they'd gotten to really know each other.
They were married like 12 years before they got pregnant.
Yeah. Well, and I would say too, you know, as we're working to reclaim our voices, it's okay to tell people, those unsolicited advice givers, that you're comfortable with the choices that you're making. And I would say, you know, take a good look at your life and say, what are the things that I want to be able to accomplish in my life without attachments? Because once you have a baby, going to the bathroom alone is difficult. I'm just going to be honest with you. Male or female, if you're going to the bathroom and the baby's not in there with you, little fingers are going to be appearing underneath the bathroom door and wiggling to make sure that you're still okay while you go pee for 30 seconds by yourself. So what are the things in life you want to do where you can be the primary focus in order to better take care of those little fingers coming under the bathroom door that you may want at another time in life? So I want you to be able to focus on, what do you value? What does the rest of your life look like? I could have started my family 5 or 10 years later. I could have finished my degree first if that's what I had wanted to do. And really the long-term picture of my life, I probably still would have had a lot of kids because I freaking love kids. I do. So I probably still would have had a large family as long as Mason was okay with it. But things like if I had known the demand of medical school, I might have wanted to slow down on having babies, because during medical school, I raised those babies. I was a single mama to at the time 6 kids. That was very overwhelming because Mason had to focus on medical school. You know, if there was a trade or a business, or I wanted to get some money in the bank, all of those are good goals. But keep in mind that perspective. What does this look like if I do it today? What does it look like if I wait a few years? What do I want to do? I would say family planning, like actually sitting down, and when we do our 5-year plan and our 10-year plans, instead of making those all about money and career, let's throw in, you know, what are some things we want to accomplish prior to having a child. I know that both Mason and I were musicians. I would have loved to have had the opportunity while I was very young to play in an orchestra in Europe or somewhere else in the world. I would have loved to have some of those exploratory opportunities. And it never occurred to me that that would be an option, because the expectation was graduate from high school, get married to a return missionary, and have as many children as you possibly can, so that the most spirit babies from heaven can be raised in the gospel. And what I didn't recognize at the time was that by being pressured into that, I gave up who I was before I even knew myself. And that it has taken a lot of work later in life to reclaim that part of me. And that by doing so, I gave over all of the control of my life to other human beings. And as I've gone, oh shit, I cannot be in a position where if, you know, my husband and I were to get divorced, or he was to pass away, or something happened, I don't have a savings, I don't have a retirement, I am completely dependent on other people. And so I would say, you know, sometimes life happens and you rise to the occasion and you start your family young. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes we choose to start our family young. There's nothing wrong with that either if you are the one in the driver's seat of your life. But it is okay. It is not selfish to take care of yourself so that you can show up for the human beings that you and a partner choose to bring into the life, or you on your own. There's lots of single families that do this alone and rock at it. So.
And I think the hard thing was that I was just taught this was the right way. I wasn't told there were choices.
Right. There weren't choice. I didn't feel like there were choices. I didn't. And I would say that most of the women in the Mormon church that I talked to felt that way. In fact, I remember when we were in North Carolina, our bishop and his wife had gotten married and been married for 7 years before having their baby. And I think it was because he was in medical school. I don't remember what their reasons were. But the first time she told me that, I remember judging her, like, why did you wait? What was
wrong with you?
What was wrong with you and your husband? And she was very clear to me in that she and her husband had some life goals that they needed to meet before they started their family, and that they had prayed about it and fasted about it, and they felt like that was what was right, and that they just learned to ignore all of the unsolicited advice and shaming that they got for waiting. And I look back on that now and I say, that's what I want to see. That example of we got married, we had life goals, we together, mother and father, future parents, planned this. We made having babies intentional. We made sure that we were doing well before we started bringing children into the world. And I very much admire that now. Mason, why don't you close us out?
Oh, we get to close this out? That's probably not safe.
If I take the microphone back, Danny and I will just continue to chit chat all day. We're probably going to go to lunch and still talk about this. Y'all, you're missing out. All right. Go ahead, Mace. Close us out.
Well, I need to just think, I appreciate that story because they were able to say, in this case, we've made our plans. We feel like this is what's best for us. And even for those of us who don't have a religious connection, maybe we can take that piece out too. We've made some plans. We feel like this is what's best for our family. We want to get to these goals so that we can then support our children in a more appropriate way. I think that is admirable. And the message that is
And the fact that she had to say we just learned to ignore what other people had to say is that's the bad part. The part that you have to say, Sarah, that I judged her. We have to say, yeah, I can't believe they're doing that. That's the part that's the problem, is that, and it's hard for all of us on certain things, but that's the part that's the problem, that we have to learn to ignore other people's comments. Not that we don't necessarily have to do that in our lives anyway, but that's what we're trying to fight, is that culture of this is how it has to be. And if you're not falling in line with how it has to be, then you're an other, basically, and that's just not okay. We don't want people to feel othered. We don't want them to be othered. We want them to feel value, and we want them to take the time to plan what's best for them. Really, I think that if we could get right down to it, the message is plan what is best for you. Hopefully, you can do that with some education and not just some selfishness, because we'll all make mistakes if that's the case, but we all make mistakes. Take the time to plan what's best for you and make the decisions that you feel are going to be the most helpful for you to obtain the goals that you want in your life. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a part of this conversation, especially you, Danny. Thank you for being here and sharing your voice in this podcast and trying to expand the vision of what we're looking for.
Bye, y'all. Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma is hosted by me, Sarah Westbrook, and my husband, Mason Westbrook. Produced by Daisy Girl Communications and Alex Vidalis. Our music today was Moving Forward by Run to Life.